6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Instead of entirely scrapping the space race, the Americans decided to keep going and change the technology they had as a compromise to win the race. The conflicts and compromises that have happened and continue to happen now in space agencies led to great technological advancements and will lead to the survival of the human race. One conflict that caused a technological change was the design change of the Mercury capsule. The test pilots that were going to be launched in the capsule expressed nervousness about the lack of control and the lack of windows in the capsule. As David Werner, the Director of Outreach and Education of the Colorado Springs Astronomical Society, said, "In 1961, the first Mercury missions were originally intended to put man in a bottle and send him up and back without any interaction by man. The astronauts that were test pilots didn't like that and insisted that they had the ability to have flight maneuvering control." As the document called Project Mercury, which was published in 1963, stated, "Among the suggested changes were the shoulder harness release, the spacecraft compression and decompression handles, the ready switch, and the spacecraft squib switch." Test subjects also found that when in the fully pressurized suit, none of the circuit breakers could be reached. McDonald was directed to act on these problem areas. Unquote. NASA did compromise with the pilots and added set adjustments. Having the ability to maneuver the capsule probably ended up saving the life of Neil Armstrong in the early Gemini missions, which could have ended the entire space program. Conflict and tragedy struck on January 27, 1969, when Apollo 1 and her crew went up in flames on the launch pad. Quote, "The fire on the pad during the Apollo 1 test identified a number of issues with respect of the design of the craft. A 100% oxygen environment in the cockpit was a bad idea. Use of flammable materials that could create toxic gases was a bad idea. An escape hatch that couldn't be opened by the astronauts in an emergency was a bad idea." From the flames of Apollo 1 and the death of those 3 astronauts, NASA redesigned the spacecraft to make it safer for future astronauts. Unquote. Following Apollo 1, the design of the spacecraft changed, and in turn, a technological compromise occurred, with hatches that can swing outwards during an emergency and now a 34% oxygen environment. Space travel was now a bit safer. In the years of the Space Shuttle program, there were 2 major tragedies that sparked technological change. The first happened on January 28, 1986, with the explosion of Challenger that killed all 7 of her crew. Warner commented, quote, "The Challenger incident in 1984 led to a review of NASA's safety practices. NASA's reviews led to the discovery that lower-level engineers knew about the problem, but their concerns were not properly addressed by the higher authorities. Besides changing launch procedures and making some booster design changes, the most important change they made was that anyone on any console in mission control could call a stop at any time." Unquote. Through the death of 7 people, NASA compromised its practices along with the change of the design of the solid rocket boosters. But were these compromises enough? The second disaster that occurred in the Space Shuttle program was the Columbia disaster. On February 1, 2003, and only 16 minutes away from home, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated. Warner said, quote, "The fact is that issues of the phone installation sloughing off of the main engine tank was well known since before the first launch. The problem with this design flaw was that in the original design phase, there were 2 teams. One team was working on building the main engine tank and 2 solid rocket boosters, and the other team was working on the orbiter design. The team building the main engine tank knew about the risk to in-flight issues with the foam, but never communicated these concerns to the orbiter team, until so far in the design phase that it was too late to change the design. So instead of trying to redesign the spacecraft configuration from scratch, they tried to figure out a way to mitigate the risk. Long story short, they didn't succeed and let the spacecraft fly at risk to the astronauts until the disaster finally happened. From that disaster, they developed techniques to examine the orbiter after launch, to inspect for damage. They developed, tested, and began carrying a repair kit. And they ultimately canceled the program because the risk was too great to continue its use. Unquote. This conflict had a compromise, which was to change the design of the craft and eventually cancel the program due to safety. NASA had to compromise a program that sent astronauts up on American soil for the safety of the astronauts. But conflict and compromise did not end with the shuttle program. It continues to this day in NASA's budget. Year after year, NASA's budget is cut again and again. With no way to run supply runs to the International Space Station, NASA hires private space agencies, such as SpaceX or Blue Origin, to do the supply runs as a way to compromise and to keep the ISS running. But why? Why does it matter? Why should we care about our space agencies? Well, through the observation and careful study of distant stars, the astronomical community was able to piece together a timeline of different kinds of stars' lifetimes. Bigger stars tend to have longer lifespans, but their deaths are quite dramatic, through giant explosions that are also known as supernovae, or the constant collapsing that turn into black holes. Meanwhile, smaller stars have shorter lifespans, but their lives end in a quiet shedding of their outer layers. Our own sun, being quite average, has enough mass to last 10 billion years until it arrives at its death march. When our sun finally dies, it will be in 5 billion years, and it will take us with it. First, our sun will generate heavier and heavier elements until it creates iron. Now, iron takes more energy to create than it gives off. The creation of iron is a sign of death in stars. Once the star generates a substantial amount of iron, the star expands to try to gain more energy. When the sun does this, it will devour Mercury and Venus, and will leave Earth almost touching the sun. As you can imagine, life cannot exist in these conditions. The only way of survival is to escape the confine of this planet and travel to different planets, moons, and maybe even stars. Some might view leaving Earth as melancholy or tragic, but I feel excited about the discoveries that will happen due to the human race leaving and using Earth as a stepping stone. We must move on from the Earth, or it will be the end of the human race. But not of life. Life will move on, from the infinite number of universes to the infinite amount of stars and the planets that orbit around them. It is an impossibility for life to not exist somewhere out there. One of my favorite sayings is, "We are not alone, just lonely."